I don't know if everything needs a documentary. But how did he die, though? This could have been a 19-minute YouTube video. 90% B-roll and red herrings. Hey guys, not everything needs to be a documentary. This is what happens when your true crime documentary doesn't really have any interesting true crime. Today I will be talking about the true crime documentary They Called Him Mostly Harmless. It's about a hiker called Mostly Harmless who was found dead in the Florida Everglades with no physical or digital trace of who he was, and the two Facebook detectives who try to identify the body. And of course the detectives who try and help identify the body, and the hikers who knew him, and the people who ran the DNA tests, and the guy who was falsely accused of being that dead guy, and the former editor-in-chief of Wired. So you can probably guess that there's too many characters for this 90-minute documentary. Just to go over my qualifications real quick, no need to brag, but I am a documentary minor in college, so I've taken a few documentary classes, and I sort of get the gist of what makes a good documentary or not. Of course, everyone's opinion is subjective, but that's kind of what I'm going off here. Now, from here on out, I will have to spoil this documentary, so just be warned, I will be spoiling it now. Mostly Harmless was a tech guy from New York who abused his girlfriend and then went off hiking in the woods and committed suicide. There, I summarized the documentary in one sentence. Therefore, it would have worked better as a 19-minute YouTube video, right? Well, I don't think it can be summarized in one sentence is really a valid criticism of a documentary, because if you think about it, any documentary can be summarized in one sentence, or any documentary could be edited down to 19 minutes if you really tried. And to go back to the sentence I said earlier, I wasn't summarizing the documentary itself, I was summarizing the crime. And I think people get confused on when the longer it takes to explain what the crime was equates to a better true crime documentary. Take another streaming true crime documentary that got released this year, Lover, Stalker, Killer. To explain that documentary, it would probably take 2 sentences. Streaming platforms pump out true crime documentaries like a factory, and we've been conditioned to expect twists and turns, and so when your story is just a man walking into the woods and committing suicide, people are just gonna be upset. Now, I will say the documentary is called They Called Him Mostly Harmless, and just based on that title alone, it's very easy to assume that they're talking about a murderer of some kind, to which this guy is not. So it is a misleading title, but at the same time, they did call him Mostly Harmless, so I'll talk about audience expectations later, but for now, let's talk about what the documentarian could have done differently when making this. When making a documentary, you should always chase the story. And sometimes there's going to be something that comes up that's more interesting than the story you're chasing. And when that happens, you're going to have to abandon your story and chase that. Because when there's something way more interesting just standing out, shining there out in the open, why would you only show that for a few minutes in your 90-minute documentary? It's just distracting at that point. For instance, in this documentary, we have the 2 Facebook sleuths, Christie and Natasha. Natasha used to work for a kayaking company until she discovered how misogynistic the company was and left, and by the end of the documentary, she starts her own outdooring business. And on the side, of course, she's on this Facebook page who helps identify unidentified bodies. Natasha is pretty interesting, but the real standout here, I think, is Christie. Ever since she was young, she had a dream of being a part of the FBI. But unfortunately, her house burned down, and so her family could not afford to send her to college. Therefore, she couldn't have the education to apply for the FBI, so now she just works as a dry cleaner. and she's been living out of a hotel with her sister for the past 9 years. And to fulfill this hole inside her, she's on these Facebook groups who try and solve unsolved mysteries. That right there is for like a 10-season long Hulu original show featuring any famous white woman from the ages of 30 to 50. Tell me otherwise. Of course, it just can't be that these two women just have interesting lives, but they actually have a rivalry. That's right. During the documentary, they have beef between each other, and Christie breaks off and starts her own Facebook group to try and identify who Mostly Harmless is, while Natasha is managing another Facebook group trying to figure out the same thing. And it's sort of a race between these two Facebook groups to identify this body first. But of course, the documentary doesn't exactly treat it that way. It's just sort of like, oh, these two people are both trying to figure it out. Also, they have beef. Focusing more on the rivalry aspect, I think, would have been way more interesting. There's one point in the documentary where Natasha's group has fundraised $5,000 to pay for DNA testing on Mostly Harmless. And the DNA testing will take about 5 to 8 weeks to process. Meaning, Christie now has 5 to 8 weeks to work all by herself to figure out who Mostly Harmless is before Natasha's group gets the DNA information. That's an interesting story of Natasha trying to work against the clock, but it doesn't really go anywhere, and instead they just interview the people who own the DNA testing company. Both women share stories about being cyberbullied by the other person's Facebook group, so far as to receiving death threats. Again, these are mentioned in the documentary, but not fully explored. I wish they would have shown some form of receipts about this or screenshots, but they really don't. I think these two women are more interesting than the person of Mostly Harmless ever was. We see glimpses into these women's lives, but the documentary keeps cutting back to some detective or the DNA testing people or the hikers. If the main focus of the documentary was Christie or Natasha, with Mostly Harmless as sort of a background thing, this would have been way more successful in my opinion. Because if there's one thing people find more interesting than true crime, it's Facebook drama. The average true crime watcher knows how a regular police investigation works, but they probably don't know about how these Facebook groups work. We want to see someone try and solve a mystery only from their computer alone. That right there is pretty interesting. Audiences, whether they know it or not, care about the people the most. Sure, some true crime stories are so sensationalist that it can just carry out the whole documentary on the back of it. So many twists and turns, like I recently watched The Girl in the Picture. That story just has so many twists that it just keeps you engaged no matter who's talking. But take Tiger King, for example. That was so successful only because of the characters of Joe and Carol. If it was anyone else, anyone any less charismatic, no one would really care. It would just be sort of swept under the rug and moved on. Nowadays, with streamers basically pumping these things out by the dozen, every story needs to have cheating and murder and identity theft and an art heist just to even make it to the Netflix top 10. I kid you not, this is probably about 70% of They Called Him Mostly Harmless. We put his picture out to multiple Facebook groups to see if anyone could identify him. We weren't getting anything until someone said they knew him. They didn't. And so we put his picture up on more Facebook groups until we finally found something. But that was a dead end. So we put his picture up on more Facebook groups until finally we got a hit of someone who it wasn't. They Called Him Mostly Harmless has such great characters, and the theme of this documentary should be about lost people finding lost people. And by that, I mean people lost in their lives, struggling to find a place in this world, finding their place by helping identify unidentified bodies. The documentary, I'd say, gets about 50% there with this theme and concept, tries to execute it a bit at the end, but overall falls flat. The ethics around creating true crime media is a whole separate conversation, but streamers should really stop advertising their true crime documentaries like it's the series finale of Succession. Like, look at Bama Rush. It was advertised as this never-before-seen inside look into Greek life in the Deep South, but instead it turns into the director talking about her experience with alopecia because she realized halfway through filming that, oh yeah, I can't go in and record the sorority rush process. That documentary failed because they promoted it as having access to something they didn't have access to. They Called Him Mostly Harmless fails because they almost have too much access. They interview literally every single person involved with this story. And it gets to the point where it's so unfocused. We as audiences are doing the right thing by critiquing documentaries that make mistakes like this, but we also need to be accepting of those stories that aren't all twisty and turny. The Mostly Harmless story does deserve a documentary, but a documentary focused on the people who identified him, not about the deep, dark secret of him maybe being murdered, or maybe him being a murderer. Like, literally from the beginning of this documentary, there's a detective who goes, "There's no way this guy committed suicide," to then 90 minutes later him going, "Well, I guess he committed suicide." There is a proper way of telling these mostly straightforward crime stories, and that way is focusing on a character who is emotionally resonant, a character like Natasha or Christie that gets the audience to respond. That being said, I didn't hate this documentary. I found it quite interesting, and I can't wait to see what the director Patricia Gillespie does next. And if you're a fan of documentaries, I recently did a video on the fictional documentary that predicted the plot of the Blair Witch Project. Might want to check that one out, and I'll see you guys next time. Walk on Monday, walk on Tuesday.